Okay, hello there everyone, and welcome to today's University Business web seminar. It's great to have you all with us. My name is Kurt Eisler-Durley. I am the web seminar editor and research editor here at UB, and I'll be your host and moderator. The title of our event, as you see here, is UB Survey Results, Higher Ed IT Strategies for 2020 and Beyond, and is being brought to you through the generous support of our sponsor for today, Team Dynamics. Before we get started here, as attendees are still coming in, a bit of background about our topic for today, what we'll be taking a look at. How are higher ed technology leaders utilizing IT resources today and planning to meet the challenges of the future? How are colleges and universities allocating IT budgets across the run, grow, transform spectrum of priorities? And how can IT leadership move from just maintaining technologies to growing and transforming their institutions? To explore these topics, University Business recently conducted a subscriber survey about higher ed technology leadership, budgeting, and strategy for 2020 and beyond. Today we're going to review some of the results of this survey and learn how to examine and evaluate the effectiveness of your institution's IT budget. We're looking forward to a great presentation and discussion here, plus live Q&A. We welcome your questions, so do stay tuned. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. Before we do, just some quick housekeeping. First off, as it says here, the first item for technical support, you can use the chat panel at the right side of your screen there. Just select the name of our event host, Jason York, and let him know if you're having any trouble. He'll be able to help you out there. Also, as it says here, if you need to access audio over the phone, you can dial the phone number and access code that we'll post in that chat panel at the right there that I just mentioned. Also, as I mentioned earlier, we welcome your questions. If you do have a question for either of us panelists today, you can feel free to type it in the Q&A at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen there. Just make sure it's set to all panelists. That's the default option. And we'll get to those at the end. So again, if you do have a question, feel free to type it in at any time in that Q&A bottom right-hand corner. Also, the last item here, speaking of questions, we're commonly asked about accessing a presentation at a later time, either the recording or the slides. And yes, we will be making this presentation available to everyone who registered or attended here today. So you can go back over it at a later time. If there's anything that you want to review, or if you want to share with anyone on your team at your institution, you'll have opportunity to do that. And I'll mention that again at the end. Okay, so with that, on to our program here. I'm going to get right into our survey results in just a moment. First off, just quick introductions here. Once again, my name is Kurt. I have a variety of roles here at UB. I am research editor as well as web seminar editor. And so I'll be presenting some of the survey results here to start us off. Also with us is Andrew Graff. He's Chief Product Strategist at Team Dynamics. Andrew, before we get started, you just want to introduce yourself and say hello to our audience here.
Yeah, hello everyone. Really glad to be with you today. I'm really looking forward to exploring some of these survey results that you all participated in. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for being with us, Andrew. So first off, just some background here about our respondents. So we asked them to self-identify some of this demographic information. We deployed the survey to our full subscriber list, our full audience in the UB universe of higher ed leaders, and this is who responded to our survey. So you can see we asked them how many full-time employees work in your IT department on the left there. So you can see there's a mix of various sizes of IT departments. The most respondents is at the bottom, under 25, but there's a mix of several other size institutions. And again, about the size of institution to the right, we asked them to identify their enrollment. And we had quite a mix here from all over the spectrum of various size institutions. So it was great to see that. It's always helpful in a survey to have a mix of sizes and types of institutions. So that's a little background about our respondents. One of the questions we asked was about how their IT budget was allocated. And as I said in my introduction, we were interested if you classify your spending as these three areas here: run, grow, or transform. How much of your IT budget is allocated to each of these? So obviously the leading answer, 67% of the IT budget is typically allocated towards run. So these are operations, maintenance and operations, basically. Andrew, how do you react to this? Does this surprise you at all? Does this reflect what you're seeing? It seems like this probably isn't ideal, but is the reality. Would you say so?
This doesn't surprise me at all. I think as we're working with customers in the marketplace, we see this quite frequently. And, as technology proliferates, I think sometimes people in university administrations forget that all of those new technologies we implement also have to be cared for and fed on an ongoing basis. So this trend, I think, just continues to skew towards run is what we're seeing in the market. So I would have been very shocked if it was flipped and 67% said that they were 67% of the budgets were being spent on transform. So this is a really common challenge.
Sure. And this is a good setup for later in the presentation. We're going to revisit this just so everyone knows and talk more about this kind of budget allocation and what's more ideal and how you get there. So, but this is just an introduction where people are. This is the reality. As Andrew said, a lot of our budget is spent on running, maintenance, operations, care and feeding, as Andrew put it, of our technology. So another question we asked was if respondents felt that they were meeting student expectations, particularly when it came to technology and their college experience. And we didn't want to just have a yes or no. We wanted to gauge kind of the severity or the range of responses when it came to this question. So you can see here, very small percentage said yes, they felt they were strongly. A little bit more saying they agreed they were meeting student expectations. But the leader here, more than half saying they disagreed. And then another good percentage there at the bottom saying they strongly disagreed, that they definitely were not meeting student expectations with regards to technology. So Andrew, same question there. This probably doesn't surprise you, but would you say that this is related to that previous question when we're talking about maintenance and operations and not a lot of budget allocation or time to think about growing and transforming?
It doesn't surprise me, but I guess the one thing that surprised me is that there's anyone who says they strongly agree that they're meeting student expectations at this point, especially since students are engaging with and leveraging consumer-focused technology all the time that's changing rapidly. It's really hard for most universities to take large enterprise systems and put interaction points on them that can compete with the ease and simplicity of the tools that students are using day in, day out. I think this is a constant challenge. And I'm not surprised so many people disagree, but again, when 67% of an institution's 67% of an institution's budget is being spent on just keeping the lights on, it's really hard to change this dynamic. How do we switch resources to providing technologies that not just meet expectations, but actually students are satisfied with when we're spending so much on operations? I think that's the challenge. The other thing is, I would say here, is when you say meet expectations, what are those expectations? I think you'd have a different result here if the question had been, are students satisfied with how satisfied are students with your technology? Maybe the results would have been a little bit different, skewed towards not as satisfied, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not just with regards to technology, but this is a challenge across higher ed. Is student expectations for
Mm-hmm.
their college experience are changing, and
Mm-hmm.
it's difficult for a lot of institutions to keep up with those and adapt. Interesting. So that's a good setup there. We talked about a number of challenges, right? That's kind of throwing it out there to get things started. Uh, so I'm going to turn it over to Andrew at this point to talk a little bit more about solutions to some of those challenges,
Mm-hmm.
some of the ideas and strategies. So Andrew, go ahead.
Sure, absolutely. So the context for my background is essentially working day in, day out with colleges and universities to help them better focus resources on those grow and transform areas by optimizing the resources they have, and in our experience, and obviously we don't work with every college and university out there, resources aren't growing as fast as the demands are growing of IT. So figuring out how to continually become better with the resources you have to allow them to focus has been the premium opportunity that we've seen. Now, there are exceptions to that with schools we see that have incredibly large endowments and the budget doesn't seem to be a concern, but that's not the majority. So as we look at this, what we're going to try to do is dissect this problem that we're spending a tremendous amount of time and money on run activities, combined with the fact that students are largely not satisfied with their technology experience. So the expectations aren't being met, rather. So a couple areas that we've seen schools focus on for improvement are these, and we'll break each of these down in more detail. So improving service management maturity, so process maturity, focusing on self-service, and I'll include automation in there, resource capacity planning, so doing a better job of planning where resources are going to spend their time so that those resources don't get constantly eroded by firefighting and shadow projects that pop up. And I'm not suggesting that any of these problems that we're going to talk about are occurring at any of your institutions. Obviously, I don't know your institutions intimately, but these are just things we see across the board. And then also total cost of ownership. So we're seeing a huge opportunity as technology has exploded in higher education. We continue to add more and more. We see a big opportunity to step back and review what is the total cost of ownership of these different platforms that we're using and try to find ways to make those more cost effective or choose solutions that might be more cost effective. I think one thing that gets away sometimes is the care and feeding aspect and actually measuring how much time does it take us to administer applications. Are we losing multiple FTEs to those particular activities, or we could be deploying those resources to better improve the technology experience for our students or the outcomes for our students. Okay, so we'll dissect some of these. We'll dive in. The first thing I want to talk about is assessing maturity, and there are many ways to do this. There are plenty of maturity assessments out there. Team Dynamics provides detailed process maturity assessment or services group, but the key is picking one that's fairly comprehensive, and you can combine both service management and project management maturity assessments, I think, in the same breath. The reason I say that is because we're talking about resources. So when you think about project portfolio management process maturity, a lot of that is about resource optimization and making sure that resources are focused on the highest value things. That trickles down into being able to affect these problems or driving solutions to the problems we've mentioned. So I think looking at both is important. So a holistic perspective is something I might consider or suggest considering. So there are a handful of things that you might look at. You can see an example of some high-level process areas here, and if you're starting from zero with process maturity assessment, boiling the ocean may not be the best approach. Answering a thousand question, evaluating 1,000 question maturity assessment may not be the best use of time or effort. If there are things that are glaring, right, that everyone knows can be improved, maybe we can start there. So as you look through things like assessing our resource capacity planning, how effective is our self-service, right, problem and change management. As you talk through, many times, especially the smaller the team, many times a conversation about how are we doing in these areas is a good place to start. Focus on where we think the biggest impacts are going to be. Now, as you're more mature and looking to fine tune, then the more comprehensive assessments, I think, obviously make sense. And I'm not going to dwell into actually giving you an overview of an assessment, but it is a great idea. I think the takeaway here is consider project management, process assessment at the same time as you look at your service management assessment, just because both end up having an impact on resources, which is what we're talking a lot about here. So something to think about. Now, as you're thinking about your starting point, I mentioned just the focus on, hey, where are we going to get the biggest bang for the buck? And many times when you step back and think about your process maturity as a team, you'll be able to identify a couple key areas where you're lagging or where you could affect change. Start there, right? Where are we going to get the biggest bang for the buck, and then fine tune. And there's a lot of frameworks against which you can measure. ITIL is one, and I'm sure most of you are familiar, if not all of you are familiar with the ITIL framework. So measuring against the ITIL framework, the PMBOK and the project management side of the house. And then also knowledge-centered service, KCS, is something that I highly recommend to most institutions as well. So if you're looking for a place to start for benchmarking process standards, I think those are good. I think those are all a great place to start. There are obviously others. I'm sure that people are on there saying, well, there's PRIDS too. There's all these other structures. We find that KCS, PMBOK, and ITIL are usually a great place and completely sufficient to start. Okay, the second component of this is driving self-service. So what we're finding is one of the better ways to reduce the drag on resources from a service management perspective is to be able to self-serve more students, faculty, and staff. And this goes beyond just satisfying students. I mentioned faculty and staff. Faculty and staff, as many of you know, or most of you know, can be an enormous drain on our IT resources as well. So thinking about how do we make answers to questions available. Right? We have a client portal application, which is a cornerstone of the Team Dynamics platform, but lots of organizations just have information on their website, other knowledge management solutions. Figuring that out is really important. How do we get answers to the most commonly asked questions out there and available? A couple key points here, I think, to think about. Number one, make sure that those answers are available by searching Google. Student search, faculty search. We've seen a major mistake with customers that we've helped move off of other platforms. They'll put all these answers behind this portal page or portal solution that requires authentication. Well, when somebody really needs something, the first thing they're going to do is search Google. If they can't find it, they're just going to call. So you have now not reduced the requirement for resources to help them, and now they're frustrated. So I think that's one thing to think about. Another thing to think about is how this is curated. Again, I mentioned knowledge-centered service a couple moments ago. It's a great framework for how we cultivate and grow and improve our knowledge base. One of our clients started a KCS project in January of the year they started, and their goal was to have, I think, 200 knowledge base articles by the end of the year, and by July they had 1,400. And all of that gets curated and continued to grow and continued to grow. And it was remarkable because they saw a dramatic decrease in the number of requests that hit the service desk. So there's two numbers on the screen that I wanted to mention, $22 versus $2. So HDI, Help Desk Institute, did a study and compared the cost of self-service requests versus requests that team members had to address. And the non-self-service requests cost on average $22 by the time you calculated all the time and all of the people and the different solutions that were being used. And the self-service requests cost around $2. Now, you might look at it and say, my gosh, that's a crazy difference. We'd never realized that. But what if it was half that or a quarter of that? That's still an incredible return on investment. So as you're thinking about self-service, first, how do we get the answers to the most commonly requested or most commonly asked questions out there? Think about making that publicly available. And then how do we curate this knowledge? How do we improve that knowledge base? Again, I think KCS is a great framework to do that. The other part of that is how do we automate? So I'm going to talk about that a couple times. But are there requests that we are currently fulfilling manually that are rinse and repeat? There's not a lot of variability, right, that we could actually automate on the back end. That's another incredible opportunity for colleges and universities to improve how they operate. So that's a great consideration, and I'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about total cost of ownership. And most of these little 30-second tips or ideas that I'm giving you warrant probably days of presentation each, but hopefully you'll get a couple things to go investigate. Password reset is one common area for process automation. The procurement of hardware is something that we can typically automate in many cases. The addition of users to groups in Office 365 or Active Directory, right? That's something that can often be automated. So those are some things to think about as you think about the automation opportunity. Now, when it comes to resource capacity planning, one thing to think about is that resources, for the most part, other than a pure service technician, service desk technician, or a pure project manager, wear lots of hats. So if you're a developer or a DBA or an infrastructure person, many times we're providing some level of support, troubleshooting. We are keeping the lights on in that run capacity. We are working on projects. So one thing to think about from an efficiency standpoint is how do we enable these individuals to work more effectively? Having a single platform where you can manage all of that work. So as a team member, I have one place where I can see all of my service-related work, all of my operations work, all of my project work. I can access that all. I can update it in one place. I can report out of that. That's incredibly powerful. The other thing that's beneficial is management and leadership, which I'm sure most of you are. You can make more confident decisions because all that information's in one single place. That's something to really consider. And then also thinking about how you look at a resource and determine how much time, let's say I work for you, saying how much time do we think Andrew is going to be spending on operational work, on service management type work, on project work, and monitoring it, right? Making sure that if I have projects that are helping us transform, that I'm not constantly getting pulled into these ghost projects or phantom projects that no one really knows about that's going on, that people are pulling me into. Understanding that's really important. It's amazing how much resource gets bled off into people getting pulled without their manager's knowledge into other things, or establishing a culture in your organization where if somebody does get asked to participate on something, that they bring that up to you and say, hey, if, for example, if I work for you, I'd say, hey, Kelly, I've just been asked to participate on a conversion of Active Directory and a move to Office 365. Is that okay? Can I do that? That's one place to start as well. So some things to think about. And I think that the resource challenge is obviously something that many organizations struggle with. Starting simple. Is important. I'm a huge fan of let's crawl, walk, and then run. We've seen many times organizations that have no resource capacity planning or tracking in place move all the way to tracking actuals first step. It doesn't often work. So taking a first step of saying, hey, let's just do rough estimates on where people are spending their efforts. So you're saying, Andrew, 15% on service, 40% on operations, the rest on projects. Let's start there and see if that feels right. And then progressing. The progression is a lot easier because as people are thinking about these percentages, the question arises, well, how much are you actually spending on that activity? And then it's easier to transition into tracking actual. So I like the crawl, walk, run approach quite a bit. Okay, so the last point here I wanted to talk about is total cost of ownership. And when, as all of you know, total cost of ownership for an application is, number one, inclusive of your licensing and maintenance fees, but also all the internal time that it takes to set up and then, most importantly, care for and feed. And I think that's the part that is probably most underrepresented when people go to market looking for a solution. You know, as we talk to our customers, a couple of things become evident. That managing vendor costs is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge, right? So vendors are often coming back and saying, "Hey, we're going to increase our prices substantially," and that's something you can obviously address contractually with vendors, up front, so that you're not going to get shocked at any point in your relationship with them. And then as you stack up all of the technologies that you use, and as you add to that technology stack, obviously without increasing the resources to care for and feed these particular applications, that 67% that's dedicated to runs continues to grow. So as we think about this, I'd like to make two basic points here. So let me go ahead and advance to the next slide. So as you think about system administration, evaluating how much time's actually going to be spent on the application is critical. When we are in the RFP process with universities, colleges who are looking at procuring a solution like ours, I'm always shocked how little amount of time or effort or the questions in those documents address the care and feeding aspect. So, 2 points about that. Number one, I feel like those should be asked about a lot in an RFP, and we just don't see it. But secondly, just talking to customers. This is a metric that we measure, and I'm happy to share it. For Team Dynamics, on average, it takes about 0.215 FTE to administer and care for one of our enterprise applications, and that's an industry best. But asking about it and talking to customers, we replace systems all the time where one of the driving factors is that they have 3 to 10 people dedicated to keeping this machine going. So, as you're evaluating technologies, that's something really, really key to investigate. And even asking the vendor to walk through, hey, how do you do these things? From an admin standpoint, it can really be a drain. The second part of this, too, is what can be automated within the system. I think a lot of times we talk about automation for automating processes that cross system boundaries, right? Complex processes like onboarding of a new team member. Very seldomly are organizations asking, hey, what can we automate with your tool? Can we automate user creation and permissioning? What are the things that we can do that will save us time? So thinking about that as you evaluate technologies, I think really important too. So what kind of webhooks framework do they have? What kind of API do they have for their particular solution? And once again, many of you may be asking these types of questions and examining with, a vendor's customers what the admin process looks like, and comparing that with the responses from other vendors' customers. And maybe you're also asking about, hey, what can be automated with these platforms? But, even I think it's a common question to be asked with really deeply technical solutions, right? Real deep IT operations management tools. But I think it's less common with more functional applications like a project portfolio management, service management tool, asking about, hey, what can I automate here within your tool to save me admin time, to lower my total cost of ownership. So I think that's really, really, really critical. And we just don't see a whole, unfortunately, well, I guess, unfortunately, we don't see a whole lot of that in any RFP process. But fortunately, that means there's an opportunity to improve. So I think that's I think, encouraging, and it's interesting just to me how infrequently we see those things. Okay. So, you know, as we work with universities, this is just a sampling, but as you look across these organizations, you know, like you see on the page here, you know, all these universities are trying to figure out how to work more effectively, how to reduce total cost of ownership so they can divert some of that 67% that's being spent on run into grow and transform. And that's regardless of size. It doesn't matter. Small, medium, and large, with the exception of those institutions, and there's only a handful that I know of that are so well endowed that they don't care that much about budget. But for the rest of us, it matters. So across, you know, hundreds of institutions that we work with, this is what we're seeing. Okay. The other thing that we're seeing too, which is kind of interesting and goes a little bit beyond those first 4 points, is how can we improve outcomes across the organization and reduce total cost of ownership? Well, one thing we're seeing is that service management, drop IT from service management, but just the responding to the needs of those we support is across the entire organization. Doing projects to improve how we deliver our services happens all across the organization. So one thing we're seeing is that by looking more holistically as to where service management can improve a business, that can help IT divert some of those costs as well. I'll give you great examples. So often marketing groups fulfill a tremendous number of requests from the organization, HR as well. By looking at a service management platform and saying, okay, how can that service management tool help these other groups who are now using email, web forms that we as marketing, or we as IT people have to build and maintain? How could it replace that? So you're gaining better efficiencies by helping others gain better efficiencies, if that makes sense. You no longer have to build and maintain those websites or web portals that they want so they can provide service. That can reduce your total cost of ownership and maybe even allow you to spread those licensing costs to these other groups as well. So we see a ton of need across the institution in all these different areas, and we see a real opportunity for you to drive down your total cost of ownership there too. So that's another thing that I think is probably under-investigated when people are going out, when organizations are going out to look for a solution like ours. And again, it's just an observation we've had over the years, which always surprises me. So one thing here before we get to questions, I want to talk a little bit about is sort of our philosophy about how we develop product. And the reason I share it, because I don't think it just applies to how we look at delivering product to customers, but I think it's something that you all can look at when you're thinking about building or buying a platform. The first thing I'll talk about in our philosophy, that first pillar that we look at, is accessibility. So everyone should have an exceptional experience, right? Even if they have disabilities. So accessibility is a key pillar of what we do, right? Your staff should be able to focus on serving students' needs, not processes or excessive admin costs. So again, this is about driving down total cost of ownership, making sure your resources are able to focus on grow and transform rather than run. Simple. So let's make sure that people are spending time in a fewer number of tools. In this case, a technician or somebody who's in IT doesn't have to jump from tool to tool to do their operational work, their project work, their service management work. Rapid impact. So will this solution make a meaningful impact quickly? How quickly versus the benefit? Now, obviously, there could be solutions that have tremendous benefit that will take years to realize. Of course, that's in consideration, but relative to the value, is this going to provide us a return? And then also, the last bit here is, does it fit with our budgets, right? Is this solution that we're thinking about developing going to fit with our budget today and on an ongoing basis? Or is it going to require 20 people to keep this thing fed, and that's not going to be tenable for us? And I think that if you look at these pillars that we use when we develop product, maybe this could help you in your own evaluation of technology, whether it be build or buy. Okay? So I think that's it. Hopefully this has been sort of a short, sweet, focused presentation or walkthrough of the solutions that we've seen organizations evaluating to address the problems that we talked about in the beginning. And I think we're ready for questions, but hopefully everyone had a few key takeaways in there.
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Andrew. Yeah, you gave us a lot to think about there. Some great strategies and things to look at, ideas to put in place, and hopefully help a lot of institutions, folks in our audience, to take a look at their IT processes and budget and things like that, and find a more efficient way of operating. So thank you so much. Yeah, we're going to get to questions here. Just a couple quick reminders. First off, again, we're often asked about accessing the slides or the archive recording later on, and we will be sending out thank you email later on today with links to where you can find those. If you want to go back over the presentation, if you want to share any of those tips and ideas from Andrew with anyone on your team, as you look at your strategies for 2020 and beyond, you'll have ample opportunity to do that. So keep an eye out for that. Don't worry about that. Also, another reminder, if you do have a question, feel free to enter it in the Q&A, not the chat, but the Q&A, bottom right-hand corner there. If you have any questions, we'll get to as many as we can here. First off, let's see, early on, Andrew, you talked about the maturity scale or maturity level as one of the key areas to look at. There's a question here asking, saying we're on the low end of the maturity scale. Where's the best place to start when looking at improving that maturity level, or I guess raising that maturity level? Andrew, I think you talked about identifying areas that would make the biggest impact first. Is that essentially what you would say?
Yeah. So I think a couple things. A, if you're on the lower end of the maturity scale, that's not abnormal at all. I think the majority probably are. But it's amazing what can happen when a group of professionals get together across departments and just talk about where do we think we can be better. And if nothing concrete and actionable comes out of those types of conversations, right, the next thing to do, I think, is take a standard framework. Let's just take ITIL as an example, and look at the ITIL processes and review them and just see how do we stack up against those ITIL processes. And, you know, if you don't have standard incident management processes, or you don't have standard processes for around self-service, you know, start there. I think that those frameworks are invaluable when you don't have a clearly defined path for improvement. I also think self-service is really, if you don't currently have a self-service mechanism, it's difficult for me to find a scenario where working on that isn't a good idea. So even if it's just making sure that the answers to the top 15 most commonly asked questions or requested things are out there and easily discoverable by our clients, that's a no-brainer to do that. And most of the time people can get that information by looking at the volume of service requests that come in by type, or, you know, by type of question. But hopefully that answered your question, Kurt. Do you want me to dig deeper into anything I said, or do you think anything was unclear there?
No, I think so. In fact, as you were just starting to talk about self-service as an important strategy, you know, early on you you talked about that as encouraging as much self-service as possible as one key strategy. There's a question here about that, saying we've been trying to move more tickets to self-service at my school, but most people would still rather just call IT when they have a problem. How can I drive more people to use self-service? Is some of that self-service strategy, are you almost at the mercy, or is it some of it dependent on user willingness? Do a lot of schools have to kind of overcome that or address that? How do you drive people to do that?
Sure. So a couple points. There are always going to be individuals who would just rather engage with somebody, another human being. That will not change. There will always be those folks. So you're never going to get away from it. One of our schools that I think has done a really good job has reduced inbound requests by 70%. That's not 100%. And 70% reduction in inbound requests is pretty good. So a couple things. The first is if people know that self-service is an option, those that prefer it will gravitate there. Most of the time, they don't know. So that point I made about making answers available via Google is important. Secondly, what we have found is that when people email in a request versus self-serve, or they call in, something that we can train our technicians to do is say, hey, happy to answer your question. Let me send you a link to a knowledge base article with an answer to that. And if we are practicing knowledge-centered service processes, if we didn't have the answer, we would have created a knowledge base article to answer that question, so that the next time we would then have it. That's the foundational tenet of KCS, right? Every single request should have a knowledge base article for an answer. So I think that's a key thing. Those technicians, they know when somebody asks a question, either phone or email, the response, either way, is, hey, happy to answer a question. Hey, here's a knowledge base article for the future that you can reference. And then good self-service too, will allow your clients to give feedback, to say, hey, this didn't answer my question. So you can constantly refine that knowledge base. Once again, part of KCS.
Sure, yeah, makes sense.
And by the way, it will take time. I do not have a magic wand for everyone that's going to flip a switch on moving from no self-service to 100% efficient self-service immediately. It takes time, people, it's going to take, I think from a marketing perspective, I think somebody needs to hear a message 5 or 6 times before it sinks in. This is not dissimilar. So you're going to be frustrated. I certainly have been when working with customers, when their customers say, well, I didn't know. Well, we've talked about it 3 or 4 times. Well, they need to hear it more then.
Right. Sure. And particularly in higher education, we hear that a lot for many institutions. These are large organizations that can be slow moving and slow to adopt new things.
Yep.
So that can be a challenge. Great. Thank you. So you talked about on the user side, there's another question here about kind of the other side of the equation, where someone says our project managers all like to use different tools to track projects. How would you go about getting everyone onto the same system, and what are the benefits of doing that? So sort of a centralization or standardization strategy, I think, is one of the things you talked about. How do you get your users on board to do that?
I will definitely answer that question. I had another thought about the previous question, though, that I want to make sure I mention.
Yep.
The other part about self-service efficacy is promotion. So as IT professionals, we are not typically great marketing professionals because we're IT professionals. and the opposite can be said about marketing professionals. But what we see the best organizations doing in this regards is working with their marketing groups to make sure that people are aware that self-service capabilities are out there. And so the best organizations we work with have a marketing plan. They do a rollout. They do email, text, right, website bannering. They do lots of marketing promotion. And what we have found is that marketing teams are often very happy to help IT teams to promote their solutions, but they're not asked that often to help. So a suggestion there is go ahead and reach out to the marketing group. They're probably going to be able to help the efficacy of your initiative. So back to the other question. I think one of the challenges when trying to bring project teams onto a single platform is that there's always there's a couple concerns. Number one is it's not what I'm used to. That's not the tool that I've used, and it's not the tool that I like. I have this brand bias towards a solution. So you're dealing with that many times. The second is making sure that it actually has the capabilities the core capabilities that they need. And, not every solution is going to be, I can probably confidently say there is no solution out there that's going to meet 100% of all the project management needs of every single individual in your organization, right? But figuring out what the core requirements are, it can be a good step. Evaluating, so let's say you have teams using 3 products, sitting with those teams and saying, show us how you use this, right? Without saying, hey, we're going to be switching to product X, Y, or Z, saying, hey, can you show us how you use this? And just documenting it. These are the things that you do, right? And then trying to understand that, and then looking at your potential solutions and saying, okay, how do we support these things? Because what I think happens sometimes is if you say we're thinking about switching to X and somebody has a brand bias, they'll immediately start saying, well, it doesn't do all these things. Very seldomly have we evaluated with a client how something's being used. Have we said, you know what, another tool can't do it. Another tool can't support what you do. What we have found is it's better to figure out what they're doing and how they manage and figure out if that can be improved, but at least that's baseline saying, okay, can we support your core use scenarios in this other product? Forget all the bells and whistles and the things you don't use and all the reasons that can be raised why you don't want to move to a solution even though you're not using those features, which happens all the time. But by doing that, you can say, okay, let us demonstrate. Here's how we saw you use the product day in, day out. We understand this. Here's how this new solution would do it. Here's some things that can be improved. So I think also when you're proposing a new tool, at the same time you're saying, here's how we would support your processes, and there are always going to be changes, add in value that they didn't have before. And there's usually, each tool has an advantage over another. So there's always a way to say, hey, here's how you're going to do it. Here's how you would support your work in this solution. Right? Here's some things that are changed. Oh, by the way, here are 5 things that you couldn't do before that you'll be able to do now in this, right? That's one thing. In the scenario where there's a group that just will not move off of their tool, and we see that sometimes, one thing to do is to say, okay, your team can manage your work here, but here are the things that need to be reported up the stack to management. It's a health status, a budget status, a resource status, and an overall percentage complete. We see that as well. So if there's just a group that's not going to move, they want their team-focused tool, it's probably the right approach. I would say that most commonly, if you have small non-centralized teams, they might be using a tool that's really good for a team, but it's not good when you're trying to manage an organization. It doesn't provide visibility. It doesn't provide all the reporting and things that you need. So first approach, as I mentioned, really clearly evaluate how they're using that product on a daily and weekly basis, and then look at the new product and say, okay, how do we support this? What changes would be required, and what do they get that they didn't have before? So that you've really listened to them, and then you can show them how these things would work, right? And also a transition strategy, should have mentioned that. So when somebody says, oh, we have, 50 projects in this, a path to how are they going to get those out of that tool into the other one. That's another piece of pushback. Oh gosh, we have a day job. How are we going to convert this? So if you proactively address those, we see that to be more seamless. If that group is just not going to move, they're not going to budge, the rest of the organization wants to, then specifying, hey, here's how you'll work with the enterprise solution, the kind of updates we'll need. And what we've seen over time there is sometimes those attitudes soften once the enterprise tool's in place and they see it working for other groups. And you can continually go back to them and say, hey, there's some, here's what's latest in this product. Will your groups try it? And eventually, sometimes those biases break down.
Okay, sure. Yeah, makes sense. All important steps for getting that buy-in and getting people to participate and on board.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. You've given us a lot to think about here, ideas and strategies, and some great things to look at as we examine 2020 and beyond, and take a look at our IT strategies and how we're going to approach the challenges of the future as higher ed continues to change significantly. So, thank you so much for being with us today, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you.
It was great having you.
Really appreciate it. Yep.
Absolutely. Thanks again to our sponsor today, Team Dynamics, for their generous support of our webinar. And of course, to all of you in our audience, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you found our discussion and presentation here informative and useful to you. Producing web seminars like this one is just part of our mission here at UB to inform college and university leaders like you about the latest news and trends in higher ed management. You'll find more coverage about issues such as the ones we discussed here in the pages of our print magazine, as well as on our website and our digital edition through additional webinars like this one, and in our various e-newsletters, which you can sign up for right from our website. As I mentioned before, for those of you who would like to share this webinar presentation with your colleagues, if you want to go back over the presentation at your own pace, you'll be able to access the archive recording at the URL on your screen here. We'll post that within about 24 to 48 hours there. And if you'd like to download the slides, you'll find instructions and a link to them in a thank you email that you'll receive later on today, as well as the link to this archive recording. So keep an eye out for that. You'll receive that later on today. So that is it for today's event. Once again, I'm Kurt Eisler for University Business on behalf of our production team and everyone here at UB Magazine. Goodbye, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day and have a great rest of your week. Thanks so much for joining us today.